everybody is asking it. Are we heading into a recession? Let's start with what the Biden administration is saying about this directly. So in a White House press briefing, they wrote that both official determinations of recessions and economists' assessment of economic activity are based on a holistic look at the data, including the labor market, consumer and business spending, industrial production, and incomes. Based on these data, it is unlikely that the decline in GDP in the first quarter of this year, even if followed by another GDP decline in the second quarter, indicates a recession. So there is a rumor that 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline is the one thing that means we are in a recession. But as the White House accurately pointed out, recessions are more about how people are doing economically, and you can't really determine this with any one statistic or metric. So they're right about that. But it really sounds like they're downplaying the risk of a recession that we are in right now. So what are they missing? The Democrats tweeted this out from their Twitter account. Reducing the deficit is one of the main ways we can ease inflationary pressures. And Joe Biden is on track for the largest deficit cut in history this year, over 1.7 trillion. But reducing the deficit is not necessarily something to brag about. Janet Yellen said recently in a press conference that we are in a period where there's significant financial drag, very significant financial drag. She said this because a huge factor in economic growth and economic stability is a well-managed money supply, and you need money to get things done. Everybody knows you've got to have money to make money. You need money to put people to work and pay their wages, to purchase land, to purchase machinery and tools, things that are necessary to get things done. You need money to mobilize resources and labor. You've got to put money into the economy to put our productive capacity to use. A rapid reduction in the money supply, it can curb growth and really jeopardize the stability of our economy. Economist Wayne Godley, who became very popular because he was quite effective at predicting recessions, he put it this way. He said there are 3 main sources for us to increase the money supply. One, the private sector, so think of households and businesses. The other, the US government, the Fed. And the third, the foreign sector. For any sector of our economy to be in surplus, another one has to be in deficit. This often means the federal deficit, and the federal deficit isn't necessarily debt. It's simply a record of all of the dollars put out into the economy that haven't yet been taxed back out, and these dollars are not necessarily backed with bonds. When the federal deficit increases, more dollars are out in the economy. It's simply a record of the dollars that have gone out. They're a surplus for everyone in the private sector, so all of those households and all of those businesses. And as Stephanie Kelton, Bernie's former chief economist, would put it, their red ink that they mark down as deficit is our black ink. That's money circulating in the economy. She would also warn us that constraining the federal deficit too much can plunge the private sector, so households and businesses, into deficit. And for them, that is debt. That is money that they have to pay back to someone else. And that is a condition that has led to recessions in the past. But the Biden administration has boasted a lot about the recovery, that things are looking better. People are spending money on goods and services, flying in planes again, eating out and shopping and spending money. The recovery looks good for the upper class in the United States. Bill McBride at Calculated Risk tweeted this out. He said, "We're back." And we see this graph here. Let's leave this up for a second. It seems great, whereas it took 75 months to claw back nearly 9 million jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. See the blue line for 2007. It took just 30 months to add back the 22 million jobs that were lost during the COVID recession, instead of yet another long and painful job recovery. Instead, we got a V-shaped job full recovery. So that's the red line there. That's how Stephanie Kelton would put it. And I would point to this V-shaped line and say that this fast recovery was thanks to the spending of the American Rescue Plan. But as the Biden administration said, we can't just look at GDP or jobs and say, look, the economy's back, we've recovered. you really do have to look at all of the data, and what the data shows is pretty concerning. The true story here is that most everyday working people in the United States are cutting back on spending and are working more jobs. A month ago, people were concerned with what Walmart was reporting on. CBS wrote, Walmart reported that high costs for food are squeezing customers' ability to spend on discretionary items like furniture and electronics. So an analysis of consumer spending at Walmart showed everyday people were cutting back a month ago when people were bragging about the recovery. This month, Walmart has seen an uptick in revenue, and people are taking this as a sign that we might not actually be at risk of a recession. But this isn't because people are spending more money at Walmart, it's because people are leaving other more expensive stores, and Walmart's seen an increase in customers. Their CEO, Doug McMillon, said, "We're pleased to see more customers choosing Walmart during this inflationary period." The evidence of recession isn't just in the spending, it's also in jobs. The July jobs report affirmed this, and while the administration is celebrating employment rates surpassing pre-pandemic levels, there's some concerning data in there as well. The number of people working multiple jobs jumped 92,000, a whopping 549,000 more versus July 2021, just a year ago, reporting from Stephanie Kelton at The Lens. More data backs this argument that the recovery has been concentrated to people with college degrees, which is another major class indicator. Graduate degree holders gained 3.8 million jobs, bachelor's degree holders gained 4.7 million jobs, and associate's degree holders gained 3.1 million jobs compared to workers with a high school diploma or less who added only 80,000 jobs. That data comes from the Center on Education and the Workforce in Georgetown University. And now we're in this situation where the Federal Reserve has decided to tackle inflation and our current economic predicament with raising rates, really categorizing this as a demand problem, which according to the Economic Policy Institute is not supported by the data. They wrote, many countries have experienced a rapid acceleration of core inflation. A good reminder, this problem is not concentrated to the United States. Inflation is not uniquely a US problem. The economic policies that spearheaded the rapid economic recovery, rather than the specific policies of the Biden administration driving inflation, the roots of today's inflation are a more complicated cocktail of other forces, from the spike in raw material, energy, and commodities prices, due in large part to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to lingering supply chain disruptions and distorted consumer demand patterns stemming from the pandemic. These shocks and their unexpectedly large ripple effects are the global expansion for rising inflation. So it seems as though we have taken a policy approach to solve a problem that isn't relevant to the problem. This is like if I felt very sick and I started taking antibiotics, but I didn't have an infection, and then the antibiotics made me feel more sick. Raising rates and constraining the money supply is making things worse, not better. And so this is really a story of the haves and have-nots, and we're jeopardizing our recovery by not addressing the root causes of inflation and making people worse off. And I think it can be argued that the administration might know exactly what they're doing, and it's not an accident. These are pretty smart people. But Anna, I would love to get your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, I actually have a pretty different point of view and analysis on the idea of increasing the money supply, because when we increase the money supply, especially after the 2008 economic crash, what we saw was the Federal Reserve essentially pumping money into banks and the companies that were failing. And the idea, especially with the banks, was, okay, we're gonna give you essentially interest-free money, which you can then pump into the economy in the form of small business loans, in the form of mortgages to help fire up the mortgage market, the housing market again. And what ended up happening was these banks decided, wait, why don't we just take this free money essentially and invest it ourselves and make this money work for us? And so what they ended up doing, and we saw this also occur with private equity firms during the pandemic, is they started buying shares of their own stock. So they did corporate stock buybacks. They also went off to basically buy the inventory of homes available on the market at the time, rather than giving out mortgages to individuals who had the correct credit score and everything necessary to qualify for a mortgage. A lot of people wouldn't even qualify for one. And so that did lead to inflation, not with everything that we're experiencing inflation-wise today, right? There are supply chain issues. The war in Ukraine obviously has something to do with it. But when it comes to so-called asset bubbles, that's where the Federal Reserve really came in and created that problem. Nomi Prinz, who wrote this really great book called Collusion, and it's not related to Russia. It's just about central banks and their role in basically increasing inequality, not just in our country, but across the globe. She talks about how this led to, people being priced out of the housing market. It led to asset bubbles, especially when it comes to the stock market. When you have corporate stock buybacks, all that really does is artificially inflate the value of the shares, because there's really no productivity or economic activity happening here. It's just a way to game the system. Now, with that said, though, what also ends up happening by increasing interest rates through the Federal Reserve is, you're right, it becomes much more expensive for ordinary working Americans to borrow money. But I think if you look back at the financialization of our economy, that is really where the root problem lies, because we started basically allowing for Americans to just take out more loans to make ends meet, rather than ensuring that their real wages were keeping up with inflation. And so if you look at the 1970s and how wages have remained stagnant since then, you'll also notice that Americans are increasingly borrowing more money through personal loans, through credit card debt. And we have record consumer debt today as a result. I think we need to go back to the pre-financialized economy, where Americans were making good money, decent wages. They were able to live the so-called American dream, and they didn't have to dig themselves into a massive amount of debt. But I do think that the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low is actually pretty damaging to the economy.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought up the point about central banks and how they're currently operating to increase the money supply, because it's a crisis and it's outdated. To have central banks decide that the way that they are going to influence our money supply is to outsource money creation to private banks. Our central bank should be confident in their ability to fund public programs with a high return on investment. We can increase the money supply in all sorts of ways. We should not have our economy running so that the central bank outsources money creation to private banks. How it currently works right now is the Federal Reserve is going to say, okay, we need more investment, we need more spending. Maybe the economy is getting a little bit cold. We're not seeing, high levels of employment. Labor have too much power and be negotiating for too high of wages. So let's actually increase interest rates and ensure that people who are bankers have more expenses, right? It becomes more expensive for banks to borrow money from the federal government when rates go up. And then in turn, they make rates more expensive for people who want to borrow money and start businesses, invest in businesses, which will eventually, lead to more jobs, right? And so if they start these new businesses and it's only a few people who can afford them, it's pretty much people who are proven to do a good job running businesses because banks want a return on their investment. But this causing less jobs is really their intent when they're raising interest rates, right?
That's right.
Yep. Less people are working, they have less money, they're not spending that money back to the economy, but also by raising rates and curbing economic activity, what you're doing is also reducing supply. And so you're just pretty much dampening what's going on in the economy. And what can happen instead of increasing the money supply, through the private sector, I would encourage everyone in Congress to realize that it's in your power to spend money with votes. You do this every year with the defense budget, passing a ton of spending for defense without backing that spending with bonds. You can do the same thing with an investment in renewable energy infrastructure and employ a bunch of Americans as well-paid public employees at a living wage. And guess what? Now the private sector has to compete with what you're offering your workers, and this raises the bottom line for everyone. And investments in things like renewable energy, like wind and solar, extremely high return on investment. So when you talk about, being concerned about spending, as we'll hear Jerome Powell and Ted Cruz complaining on Fox News and all kinds of people talking about spending causing inflation, they're really afraid of what we can do with public spending, because this kind of spending is not an inflation risk if it's done right. But they're taking a ton of money from bankers who want all new money to enter our economy through the way it always has, through private banks. And it's time we realize we don't have to outsource that to private banks. So it's such a good point.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because you can also, I talk about the financialization of our economy, so that I think is the root of the problem. But I think a short-term fix, because reversing that is gonna take a lot of work, a lot of time. But I think a more short-term fix would be to establish public banking, through the post office, for instance, where the government is lending directly to the American people, as opposed to giving the money to private banks, who, of course, at the end of the day, we all know what private banks want. Their bottom line is their, profit motive. They want to make sure that they maximize their profits. And so you got to take that part out of the equation in order to ensure that we're actually increasing the money supply to the individuals who actually need it, to maybe start their own small businesses, buy a home, whatever it is that they might need to take a loan out for. The one other thing I want to mention, because it's not all bad news, you did a really good overview of the economy. I'm always pretty skeptical of jobs reports, because they leave out the number of individuals who have given up on looking for work. And when you see the increase in the number of people working multiple jobs, we kind of get a sense of the quality of jobs that are out there for people to take. So I wanted to mention that. And then final thing I'll say is, look, one of the, positive aspects of the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates is that if you have a portion of your money in just a traditional savings account, I usually don't give out any financial advice because I'm not an expert, but I feel very confident in what I'm about to say. Higher interest rates mean you could also get a higher interest rate on a savings account, okay? I'm not talking about stock market stuff. I'm talking about just strictly a savings account that is not tied to the stock market. There's no risk. If you are putting your savings in like Chase Bank or Bank of America, take that money out, okay? Research online FDIC insured banks that at this point, I have mine in a bank account that is earning 2.5% interest. Earn some interest on that money, because it's out there, it's available, and make sure it's FDIC insured, that it's federally insured. So if the bank crashes or something, you're able to recoup your money through the federal government.
Yeah, I love that we're talking about the financialization of the economy, because so many people are like, well, the really rich guys in America must have just worked so hard, and that's how they got all of their money. No, the rate of return on capital is much higher than the rate of growth in our economy right now. That's why we see inequality exacerbating to the extent that it really is. So these are people who have a sum of money. Maybe they're from a very wealthy family. Maybe they've acquired it in an honest way. Maybe they got it through a loan. In any sense, they've acquired a lump of capital. And what they've done with all of that money is make other investments. There are many people, the richest people in our country for sure, make their money off of the existing money they already have. They're not working for it. And because the rate of return on capital is much higher than the rate of return and much faster than the rate of return on economic growth, they've amassed a ton of wealth. And it's not reflected by real goods and services, real things of value actually being produced. And we're at the point where GDP is not an accurate reflection of the total goods and services in our economy. It's a huge problem. Unless we regulate Wall Street to the extreme, and tax wealth extremely and tax income extremely in corporate taxes, and actually do something about stock buybacks, which cinema rumor has it is the reason that people were removing it from the IRA.
And oh God, she's the freaking worst.
She's the worst. She's the worst.
I can't stand her. I really can't. And like the shamelessness of everything she's up to lately, it's just can't stand her. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you. Continue.
And she's fighting for these guys because they're lining her pockets. And it's not in the interest of anyone to have these people have the ability to inflate their stock.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.